Hey guys, tonight we step into a story whose very names once made all of Europe tremble. Henry VIII, and the three women who reshaped his fate. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Jane Seymour, along with the chain of mysterious events filled with passion, betrayal, desperation, power, and choices so seemingly small yet powerful enough to reroute the course of human history. Tonight, we are not merely telling a story. We are tracing the paths of letters no one was meant to read, confessions buried in silence, and moments where a single nod from the king could make hundreds of people tremble. You will witness a queen abandoned, yet never broken, a brilliant young woman who forced an entire kingdom to choose between love and law, a death so quiet it became terrifying, and a child born to save an entire dynasty, but whose birth took away the only woman Henry ever truly loved. And everything begins with one question that seems deceptively simple. Can one man change the entire religion of his country just because he wants a son? As you will soon see, the answer is far more complicated and far darker than any fairy tale ever told. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Before we open the door to the dim corridors where history changed direction, tell me, which city are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? I love seeing this community stretch across so many time zones, sitting together, breathing slowly together, sinking into a deep night of history together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. On the morning of the 22nd of August, in the year 1485, England stood at the trembling edge of a new age. A pale sun struggled to rise over the muddy fields of Bosworth, where the smell of iron, wet earth, and the heavy tang of blood hung thicker than the sacred incense that once drifted through cathedral aisles. For nearly 3 decades, the war between the houses of Lancaster and York, later romanticized by poets as the so-called War of the Roses, had been nothing but a long, grinding slaughterhouse, a place where 2 royal lineages carved each other open in the name of power. And now, on this dim morning, the English nobility had almost extinguished itself. Across the soaked, torn ground, where mud swallowed bootprints and bodies alike, the last king of the Plantagenets lay dead. Richard III, once a monarch, now only a broken body, was stripped naked, hacked to pieces like a maddened beast, and tossed across a horse's back as carelessly as one might throw a sack of grain. No heraldic banners protected him now, no loyal retainers guarded his fall. His story ended in the dirt, and the silence that followed was not peaceful, but hollow, as though the world itself paused to draw breath after too many years of screaming. In that vast emptiness of power, England felt tired, tired in its bones, tired in its soul. Each morning, common folk had awakened unsure which cousin of which noble house now claimed the crown, and whether the banner flying over their town gate would change again by sunset. The lords of the realm, those feudal warlords who treated the kingdom like their private chessboard, had either fallen in battle, lost their fortunes, or hidden inside their crumbling stone keeps, hoping someone else would die first. When the clashing steel finally quieted, the battlefield sank into a chilling stillness, the kind of silence that comes only when an old order lies face down in the mud, unable to rise again. Out of that shadowed landscape, the man who stepped forward to claim the future was not a hero, not a warrior bathed in glory, but a survivor who understood timing better than anyone alive. Henry Tudor. 20 years earlier, hardly a soul would have gambled even a single coin on his destiny. His royal bloodline, stretched thin through a female branch, was viewed by many as nearly non-existent. Some said counterfeit, some said cursed. 14 long years spent wandering in exile through the courts of Brittany and France carved him into something sharper, quieter, more patient than other men. Exile had taught him that survival was not a matter of strength, but of waiting for storms to pass, for enemies to falter, for fate to blink. Patience, he learned, could be honed finer than any blade. He was not the strongest claimant, not the most beloved, certainly not the most obvious, but he was the one left standing when every other path had collapsed. And sometimes, simply being the last is enough. The symbol of his unlikely ascent came not in a coronation hall, but in a tangle of wild hawthorn. Richard's fallen crown, its gold dented, its jewels dulled by mud, had been struck from his head and flung into a thorny bush. Lord Stanley, who had hovered between allegiances until the final heartbeat of battle, rode forward, plucked the crown from the bramble, and placed it upon Henry's head there on the open field. The gesture, quiet yet thunderous, echoed across generations. From that moment, the crown in the hawthorn bush became the unofficial emblem of the Tudor beginning, a monarchy not bestowed by divine ceremony or ancient rite, but wrestled from chaos, lifted from blood-soaked soil, and claimed by a man who knew that crowns gained in mud had to be guarded with something colder than iron. And so, as the morning mist curled around the dead and the living alike, England exhaled a long, trembling breath. The war was over. The old world had sunk into the earth, and the first hesitant footstep of the Tudor age pressed softly into the wet ground, unaware of how heavily its shadow would fall upon the centuries to come. The rise of Henry VII did not merely replace one king with another. It altered the entire architecture of monarchy itself. Before the Tudors, a king was expected to be a medieval warrior, a figure defined by the sword, by armour, by the ferocity of battle. After the Tudors, the king became something far more modern, far more calculated, a political performer who understood that power was not only seized but displayed. Yet, beneath the polished surface of ceremony, beneath the velvet robes and gilded processions, there pulsed a deep and relentless wound, the wound of insecurity, the constant ache of a man whose claim to the crown was thin as parchment. Because his bloodline was fragile, because whispers could unravel the legitimacy he worked so desperately to hold together, the Tudor court lived in a state of quiet panic. In such a world, anyone might be a usurper, any smile might hide ambition, and the failure of a queen to bear a male heir could be interpreted not as misfortune, but as treason. The Tudor century was a great spiral, pulling England from the dimness of the Middle Ages into the sharp light of the Renaissance. They severed the kingdom from Rome not in the name of profound theology, but because biology betrayed them. The need for a son, the dread of a disputed succession, the terror of a hollow cradle. They burned heretics, executed queens, beheaded cardinals, and in doing so transformed a mist-covered island into a naval power. But one must not let the gleam of the crown obscure the truth. At the centre of the Tudor story lies a tragedy shaped by men and women attempting to bend the world to their will, even if it meant challenging God himself. The winter of 1485 settled over London with a heaviness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the city itself hesitated to welcome a new reign. The streets were slick with frost, the river moved slowly beneath sheets of thin ice, and the chimneys exhaled smoke that clung low to the rooftops. But the true terror arrived not from the cold, but from the invisible breath of sickness. The dreaded sweating sickness, brought by mercenaries from France, crept through the city like a whispered curse. It struck its victims swiftly, drowning their bodies in fever and sweat, taking life not in days but in hours. In that atmosphere of dread, where each cough felt like a death sentence, and each church bell seemed to mourn someone newly taken, Henry knew he had to act quickly. He needed to prove that he was not merely a fortunate survivor of Bosworth, not merely a Welsh outsider who had stumbled into a crown. He had to show England he was its rightful king. To be accepted by the English nobility, a class hollowed by war, but still proud of its lineage, Henry required a living shield, someone whose blood would silence doubt. That shield was Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth, daughter of Edward IV, embodied everything the old era cherished: beauty like polished gold, a gentle temperament, and the pure, uncontested Plantagenet lineage. Her presence alone could calm factions that still muttered the names of dead kings. Their union was not a love story, it was a pact of survival. Yet Henry delayed their marriage for 5 months. He refused to let England believe he owed his crown to her claim, or that he wore the crown only through her grace. He demanded that Parliament first declare him king by right of conquest, a stern proclamation carved from pride and fear alike. Only after the ink on that declaration had dried did he agree to take Elizabeth as his wife. He wanted the world to know that he had won the crown with steel, not through the body of a woman. On the 18th of January, in the year 1486, the wedding took place beneath flickering candlelight inside Westminster. The incense drifted through the arches, the choir sang with measured solemnity, and those who watched understood that something larger than a marriage was unfolding. The houses of Lancaster and York, 2 families that had torn the nation apart, were being bound together not by treaties or proclamations, but by the hands of two young people who scarcely knew each other. More importantly, Henry used the body of Elizabeth, her name, her lineage, her womb, to stitch together the wound that had split England for nearly 30 years. She was both queen and symbol, both bride and remedy. Yet even as the vows were spoken and the bells cried out across the frozen city, Henry knew the truth with unsettling clarity. This moment was only the beginning. The storm that had lifted him to the throne had not yet passed. It had merely changed its shape, waiting to rise again. After marrying Elizabeth, Henry began what would become the first great branding campaign in European political history. The Tudor rose, the white rose of York, nested inside the red rose of Lancaster. Though such a flower could never exist in nature, it became truth through sheer repetition. Carved into ceilings, stitched into the coats of soldiers, pressed into the metal of new-minted coins, it declared, with quiet finality, no more York, no more Lancaster, only Tudor. But the past does not rest merely because a king wishes it to. The two princes, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, had vanished into the stone walls of the Tower of London, and their bodies were never recovered. No bodies became a throne that can be stolen, an open wound where ambition could nest. The unanswered question of their fate invited a dangerous game. If the rightful heirs might still live, then Henry's crown might still fall. And so the first ghosts began to rise. Lambert Simnel was the opening act. A desperate priest, half hoping for redemption and half seduced by the promise of influence, discovered a young carpenter's apprentice whose features faintly resembled those of the royal family. The priest educated the boy, drilled him in manners and bearing, and then announced that he was the Earl of Warwick, the imprisoned nephew of Edward IV. Ireland, a land long resentful of English rule, embraced the fiction eagerly. On the 24th of May, in the year 1487, inside the cathedral in Dublin, Simnel was crowned with a circlet taken from the statue of the Virgin Mary, proclaimed King Edward VI. It was a coronation so false that it bordered on sacrilege. The rebellion marched into England with foreign mercenaries, hardened by years of war and willing to fight for any cause that promised coin. But at Stoke, in 1487, the illusion shattered. The battle was brutal and brief. Nearly 4,000 men died, buried in mud and trampled grass. When Simnel was captured, he expected death. Any cruel monarch would have executed him for treason, if only to silence imitators. But Henry chose a subtler path. He transformed the boy into a kitchen servant, responsible for turning the spit over the royal fire, converting a would-be pretender into a childish spectacle. It was not mercy, not truly. It was psychological warfare, a message carved not with a sword, but with humiliation. Henry proved that rebellion could be reduced to comedy, that he could crush a threat without spilling a drop of royal blood. But the second challenger was not a joke. He was a nightmare. Perkin Warbeck was everything Simnel was not. Handsome, articulate, poised, and widely believed to be the lost Prince Richard. Trained and supported by Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of Edward IV Warbeck, was shaped into a living weapon, a polished counterfeit designed to wound Henry precisely where he was weakest. Legitimacy. For 6 long years, European courts welcomed him as Richard returned from the dead. Kings and dukes received him with ceremony. Ambassadors knelt to him. Rumours spread across the Channel like wildfire. The true prince lives. Henry knew force alone would not be enough. Instead, he wielded economics as a blade. He cut off English trade with Flemish merchants, strangling Burgundy's wealth until their support for Warbeck became untenable. One by one, the great houses and foreign rulers abandoned the pretender, leaving him drifting like a ghost without a host. By the time Warbeck landed in Cornwall in 1497, he had fallen from royal guest to desperate fugitive. He arrived with only a thin crowd of farmers carrying picks and spades, more curious than loyal. And when Henry's forces closed in, Warbeck fled, was captured, and finally confessed. He admitted he was the son of a boatman from Tournai. No prince, no heir, only a gifted actor who believed his performance might reshape the world. Henry spared his life at first, keeping him at court under watch, a tamed spectacle like Simnel before him. But when Warbeck attempted escape, Henry's patience ended. In the year 1499, Warbeck was hanged. With that final execution, the royal phantoms were silenced. No more lost princes, no more whispered heirs. no more shadows threatening the fragile Tudor dawn. But the greatest danger still remained, not in Ireland, not in Burgundy, not in France, but at home. Henry now turned his gaze to the most dangerous enemy of all, the English nobility, the men who had toppled kings for 30 years, who had changed sides like shifting winds, who wore loyalty as a mask and ambition as their true skin. The Wars of the Roses had shown Henry one lesson above all. Kings fall not by foreign armies, but by the hands of their own lords. And so, in the soft, cold quiet of the Tudor night, Henry began preparing for his next campaign, a war not fought with swords, but with laws, spies, fines, and silence. The ghosts were gone. The nobles were next. Henry VII, unlike the kings who came before him, understood a truth sharper than any axe. Executing nobles did not eliminate rebellion, it fertilized it. Kill a lord, and his sons would rise. Kill a dynasty, and a dozen wounded cousins would emerge from the shadows. If he wanted to rule England, truly rule it, he could not cut off heads. He had to cut off wealth. And so he crafted one of the quietest, coldest, and most terrifying revolutions in English history. He turned the nobility into financial hostages of the crown. The Star Chamber, its ceiling painted with gold stars glittering against deep blue, became his hidden underworld. No jury sat within its walls, no bribes could soften its verdicts. Only swift convictions, silent proceedings, and judgments that fell like winter frost. Yet Henry did not seek blood. He sought bonds and recognizances, debts on paper, obligations sealed with trembling signatures. They were more effective than chains, because chains could be broken. Paper could not. The most telling example was the case of the Earl of Oxford, a man who had once saved Henry's life on the battlefield. To honour his king, Oxford prepared a lavish feast, greeting Henry with an escort of servants dressed in matching livery. But the display that was meant as loyalty became, in Henry's eyes, a threat. Too many servants meant a prime time, and so Henry fined Oxford £10,000 a sum, that today would stretch into many millions. Unable to pay, Oxford signed a bond instead, binding himself to the crown like a debtor to a creditor. From that moment forward, he was free in body, but imprisoned in fortune. Henry needed only to whisper suspicion, and Oxford would collapse financially. This became the model. By the end of the reign, 3/4 of England's nobility lived under such financial constraints, controlled not by swords, but by ink. The enforcement of this shadowed system fell to two men, Empson and Dudley. They were Henry's financial hounds, relentless and unloved, feared in manor halls and marketplaces alike. Alongside them stood Henry's most elegant weapon, the razor-sharp reasoning of Cardinal Morton, whose doctrine came to be known as Morton's Fork. Its logic was a trap with no escape. If a man lived extravagantly, he was clearly wealthy and must contribute to the king. If he lived modestly, he must be saving money and could contribute even more. Extravagance proved guilt. Frugality proved guilt. There was no path untouched by tax. Henry did not build a kingdom of glittering palaces or mighty fortresses. He built a kingdom of ledgers. He controlled violence by controlling the money that paid for violence. The swords of England rusted quietly while ink sharpened its edge. The realm drifted from a warrior society into a society of bookkeeping, a transformation as profound as any war. But every kingdom ends, even one built on caution and calculation. By the year 1509, Henry's lungs filled with the slow, cold weight of tuberculosis. As fear of judgment tightened around him, he spent his final months buying peace for his soul. He paid for 10,000 masses to be said, distributed silver alms to the poor, and released prisoners in acts of desperate piety offerings for heaven, in the last hours of a man who had always trusted accounts more than angels. On the 21st of April, he died. Across England, a long-held breath was released. Empson and Dudley were thrown into prison. Their names were spoken with hatred in taverns and whispered with relief by nobles who at last felt the noose loosen from their purses. And then, through the grey veil of dawn, stepped a new king, Henry VIII, 17 years old, radiant, athletic, unscarred by the wars that had shaped his father. He appeared like sunlight after a winter that had lasted too long, a prince of promise, adored before he even spoke. The people welcomed him not merely as a monarch, but as a rebirth. Little did they know that the brilliance of this rising sun would one day burn hotter, brighter, and far more dangerously than any winter they had ever endured. Henry VIII, in his youth, was nothing like the swollen, furious monarch the world now remembers. He was known across Europe as the Golden Prince, a towering figure, nearly 1 meter 9 in height, with a waist scarcely 80 centimeters around, built like an Olympic champion, his hair a burnished red gold, his skin bright, his smile disarming. He spoke French, Latin, and Spanish with ease. He studied astronomy, theology, and humanism. He rode horses with the grace of a knight from legend, and composed music so skillfully that his song, Pastime with Good Company, echoed through courts from Lisbon to Vienna. After the shadowed, suffocating years of Henry VII, this radiant young prince felt to England like a sudden burst of technicolor after a lifetime of grey. He opened the palace gates, revived the old pageants, revived the tournaments with glittering armour and roaring crowds, revived the feasts and masques and dances. He stepped into the world, not as a bureaucrat or a war relic, but as a hero from an Arthurian romance, a king as poets imagined kings should be. But even in that bright veneer, the first quiet cracks already existed. Henry loved pleasure, but despised governance. He adored the crown, but loathed the daily weight of ruling. He wanted glory, not paperwork, fame, not meetings, celebration, not statecraft. And so he handed the true machinery of government to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, whose rise was as improbable as it was extraordinary. Wolsey, the son of a butcher, climbed through church and court, using nothing but the ferocity of his intellect. He could handle correspondence faster than 10 clerks combined, negotiate with the smoothness of a diplomat born to the task, and read political landscapes with the instinct of a seasoned general. Under his guidance, England, a small, often overlooked island, became a central figure in the volatile triangle of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. He controlled foreign policy, taxation, espionage, and nearly every lever of power. People murmured that he was the second king, and Henry did not mind. It meant Henry could live the life he wanted, rich, adored, unburdened. The peak of this glittering era came in the year 1520, at the event that Europe still remembers with awe, the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It was a summit disguised as a festival, a meeting of kings dressed as myth. A temporary palace made of cloth, woven with gold thread, rose from the fields near Calais. Fountains poured wine instead of water. 2,800 tents covered the hills. Horses pranced. Musicians filled the air with fanfares. Nobles feasted beneath silk canopies. It was a royal Glastonbury, a shimmering display of wealth meant to stun the world. But beneath the spectacle, pride simmered. Henry, hungry for admiration, challenged King Francis of France to a wrestling match. Before the gathered nobility, before ambassadors, before knights and trumpeters and lords dressed in colours brighter than jewels, Francis grabbed the English king and threw him to the ground. A moment brief, physical, undeniable, shattered the illusion Henry held of himself. The crowd gasped. Henry flushed with humiliation. Diplomacy collapsed. The alliance fell apart. And the staggering cost of the festivities drained the treasury of a sum equal to an entire year of national income. It was here in this gilded field of wine fountains and ruined pride that the age of the perfect prince began to fade. Henry returned to England heavier, moodier, and restless. Something had shifted inside him. The laughter no longer echoed quite as brightly in the hall. The tournaments thrilled him less. The songs he composed sounded thinner, somehow sadder. And into that growing silence crept a question darker than any that had occupied him before. Why do I not have a son? It festered quietly at first, like a whisper at the edges of the mind. But Henry's world, a world built on inheritance, on lineage, on the fragile thread of legitimacy, had no room for unanswered questions. A daughter was not enough. A failed pregnancy was not misfortune. It was danger. And so the light of the Golden Prince dimmed, the shadows lengthened, and England stood unknowingly at the threshold of its greatest tragedy. The pursuit of a male heir, a desire as old as kingship itself, would soon sink the realm into storms from which it would never fully recover. Catherine of Aragon entered Henry's life like a quiet promise of peace. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile, the finest blossom of Spanish royalty, intelligent, devout, dignified, and fluent in Latin from childhood. She had once been the wife of Arthur, Henry's elder brother, but Arthur died before their first year of marriage had ended. When Henry ascended the throne, he married Catherine out of genuine affection. something remarkably rare in royal unions, shaped by treaties and necessity rather than tenderness. In those early years, they were Europe's golden couple. Catherine rode out to war at Flodden in the year 1513, wearing Henry's armour, commanding troops in his absence, and helping secure a decisive victory against Scotland. She sent the bloodied cap of King James IV to London as proof of triumph. She was, in those days, the one person Henry admired without hesitation, the only voice he listened to without resentment. But fate turned cruelly. Catherine conceived 6 times, and only one child survived Mary, born in the year 1516. The sons Henry longed for came into the world only to vanish. One prince died after 52 days, another was stillborn, another lived just long enough to take a breath and surrender it. Each loss chipped away at Henry, not violently, but steadily like a sculptor's cold chisel, striking again and again into marble. In the Tudor world, a dynasty without a male heir hovered over the precipice. Civil war was not an old memory, it was a recent scar. Henry saw the shadow that had buried the Plantagenets, the shadow of disputed succession, of rival claims, of blood in the streets creeping toward him in his crown. The fear took root, grew claws, and twisted into theological panic. Henry convinced himself that their marriage was cursed, because Catherine had once been Arthur's wife. Though she swore the first marriage had never been consummated, Henry clung to a single line from Leviticus. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they shall be childless. The scripture became an obsession. Every cradle that emptied, every miscarriage, every stillborn son felt to him like divine judgment. It was in this fragile, trembling world that Anne Boleyn appeared sharp-witted, quick-tongued, and wholly unlike any woman Henry had known. But the story was never simply about Anne. It was about the storm Henry had built inside himself. The joyous king of tournaments and music faded. What remained was a restless figure pacing darkened corridors, sleepless, murmuring that England will fall into chaos if I die without a son. And so Henry made a choice no English king had ever dared. He resolved to challenge the Pope, to break with Rome, and to declare himself the supreme head of a new Church of England. It was not for spiritual freedom. It was not for doctrine or philosophy. It was not for reform. It was for a boy who had never lived, for a future that existed only in Henry's fears and longing, for the phantom promise of a son. With that single decision, the Tudor world transformed. The gold of Henry's early reign dulled, darkened, and bled into red. What began as longing became revolution. What began as insecurity became tyranny. What began as grief became the spark that set England on fire for generations. From this moment, the Tudor story stopped being a tale of pageantry and began its descent into the age of broken marriages, broken faith, and broken bodies. All because one king could not bear the silence of an empty cradle. Anne Boleyn was not beautiful in the classical fashion, her hair dark as polished ink, her eyes black as ripe cherries, her skin touched by a warm olive tone. But she carried something that outshone symmetry, presence. She was sharp-witted, quick in conversation, skilled at holding a man's gaze without letting him come too close, and she refused to join the long, forgettable list of Henry's mistresses, as her sister Mary once had. That refusal, quiet, deliberate, unwavering, ignited Henry's obsession. He was a king accustomed to immediate submission. Anne's distance became a kind of intoxicating hunger. From the few surviving letters, roughly 17 of them, we see Henry not as the towering figure of power history paints, but as a man trembling with longing. He wrote to her with a feverish, almost adolescent pulse, his words soaked with yearning, desire, and a kind of helpless devotion. It is startling to witness. The most formidable ruler in Europe, a man who commanded armies and reshaped nations, begging for affection like someone starved. To Henry, Anne was not simply a woman. She was the key, the doorway leading to the son destiny had so far denied him. By the year 1527, Henry began seeking from the Pope an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. But Queen Catherine did not bow to pressure. She was the daughter of Isabella I, conqueror of Granada, a queen who had commanded armies beside her husband. Catherine did not retreat before any man, certainly not before her husband. She insisted her marriage to Henry was lawful, her dignity unbroken, her crown not subject to negotiation. Into this battlefield of theology and politics stepped Anne with words soft enough to whisper, sharp enough to cut. She encouraged Henry to see England not as a kingdom beneath Rome, but as a kingdom that could stand alone. She stirred thoughts of reform, of ending the authority of clerics who answered only to the Pope, of seizing the immense wealth stored in monasteries. What began as courtly flirtation evolved into a revolution. Anne did not create Henry's restlessness, but she gave it direction. In the year 1533, Anne became pregnant. For Henry, this was the moment he believed God had finally answered him. He married her secretly, and soon after declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, severing the bonds with Rome that had held for nearly 1,000 years. On the 7th of September, in the year 1533, Anne gave birth to a child, a girl, Elizabeth, not Edward, not a prince, and there was nothing in the world more bitter than the shadow that crossed Henry's face when he looked at the cradle. Elizabeth would grow to become England's greatest monarch, but in that moment she was only disappointment wrapped in linen. Anne's next pregnancies ended in tragedy. One miscarriage in the year 1535, another in the year 1536. The second loss came on the same day. Henry suffered a grave accident during a joust, when his horse fell upon him and left him unconscious. The palace murmured that the shock had killed Anne's unborn child, and so grief layered upon grief, casting darkness across the court like a slow-moving storm. Her enemies, especially Thomas Cromwell, began weaving accusations around her like a noose. Adultery, incest with her brother George Boleyn, treason against the king. The charges were impossible, grotesque, but the trial in May of 1536 was not meant for justice. It was a performance, and the verdict had been written long before Anne stood in the courtroom. On the 19th of May, Anne walked to the scaffold with eerie calm. She wore a simple grey gown, her small French hood framing her delicate face. She knelt before the executioner from Calais, a man chosen for his precision, for the promise of a swift death. A single stroke of the sword, light as a sigh, ended the life of the woman who had reshaped Europe's destiny. Yet as her blood seeped into the stones of the tower, Henry remained unaware of the truth he had unleashed. Anne's death did not close a chapter. It tore open a wound that would never fully heal. The child she had borne, the daughter he dismissed, would rise one day to rule with a brilliance unmatched in English history. But for the moment, all Henry saw was the empty space where a son should have been. And so, without knowing it, he had planted the seed of his own dynasty's downfall, the quiet beginning of the end, written in the crimson stain beneath Anne Boleyn's fallen body. One day, after Anne Boleyn was executed, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour, a woman who seemed crafted from an entirely different world. Where Anne had been sharp, dazzling, and electric, Jane was quiet, gentle, and soft-spoken. She knew how to step back, how to soothe rather than provoke, how to fold herself into the spaces Henry needed. She was not radiant, not intellectually fierce, not a storm that overturned kingdoms. She carried instead the one thing Henry now craved more than beauty, ambition, or brilliance: peace. Jane did something no one else had managed. She helped Henry reconcile with Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, who had been cast aside, stripped of her title, and forced to live as a servant in her own father's kingdom. Anne had never been able to mend that wound, but Jane, with steady patience and gentle persistence, stitched the fractured family back together. Henry, worn thin by years of conflict, clung to that sense of quiet restoration. In the autumn of 1537, Jane became pregnant. For Henry, it felt like the world itself was offering him a second chance. The court held its breath. The churches prayed. The kingdom, still trembling from Anne's death, watched Jane's swelling belly like a prophecy waiting to unfold. On the 12th of October of that year, she gave birth to Edward, the only legitimate son Henry would ever receive, the child he had chased through 3 decades of longing, disappointment, and political ruin. When the infant's cry filled the room, Henry wept uncontrollably. The bells of London rang until the metal trembled. Bonfires lit up the night. Barrels of wine were emptied in celebration. For a brief moment, the kingdom lifted itself out of fear and turmoil and wrapped itself in joy. But joy, in Henry's world, never stayed long. Jane fell ill within hours of the birth. Fever gripped her body. She weakened rapidly, slipping in and out of consciousness. The physicians whispered words no one wanted to hear: infection, perhaps of the womb, a cruel fate for a queen who had fulfilled her husband's greatest desire. On the 27th of October, only 12 days after giving England its prince, Jane died. Henry shattered. He buried himself in black. He shut himself away in his chambers for weeks. He spoke of Jane not as a wife, but as a salvation, the one woman who had given him what no one else could, a male heir and a sense of calm. He declared that she was the only wife he had ever truly loved, a phrase that would echo endlessly through the remaining years of his rule. Though Henry would marry 3 more times, something in him was permanently sealed the day Jane died. The king, who once danced, sang, and dazzled Europe, fell further into darkness. His body grew heavier, his temper shorter, his patience thinner. A wound had opened in the heart of a man who believed himself chosen by God, and that wound never closed. When Henry wrote his final will, years later, he made one last declaration of devotion. He ordered that he be buried beside Jane in the chapel of St. George at Windsor, side by side for eternity, with the woman who had never contested him, never defied him, never brought disaster to his reign. In her silence, in her gentleness, Henry found a brief, fragile refuge from his own storm. Jane Seymour was the soft moonlight that fell across Henry's life just before the long night descended. She was the last tenderness he would ever know. And once she was gone, the king stepped fully into the long, dark tunnel that would shape the final years of his rule. Years marked not by love or hope, but by fear, pain, and the slow unravelling of a once golden prince. In the year 1536, Henry suffered the accident that would divide his life into 2 distinct eras: the radiant youth he once was, and the dark, wounded monarch he would become. During a jousting match, the sport he had mastered, the sport that had once displayed his glory, his horse reared and crashed down upon him. The blow crushed his right leg. Flesh tore, bone splintered. The king, who had once moved with the easy grace of a champion, now lay in the mud, broken. The wound never healed. Not truly. It festered through every season. It oozed, smelled, and throbbed with a deep infection that no physician of the time could cure. It kept him awake through long nights, pacing the halls like a restless ghost. What was once a small fracture grew into a lifelong torment, one that seeped into his mind as much as his body. The man who had once danced at feasts, who had once ridden like a hero of legend, became half immobile. A king who had once seemed moulded from sunlight now lived inside a shell of pain. He ate to comfort himself, sugared pastries, rich red meats, wine poured generously, tankards of ale. His daily intake rose to nearly 5,000 calories. His waist expanded until it surpassed 1.40 meters. Court painters hid the truth, shaping him with flattering angles, but no brush could disguise the heaviness in his eyes. Pain made him irritable, sleeplessness made him cruel, and fear, that old shadow that had followed him since Catherine's failed pregnancies, began to swell again. Slowly, the wound in his leg carved a wound in his character. He began to suspect everyone. He punished anyone who displeased him. His temper grew sharp as shattered glass. Cardinal Wolsey, once the architect of Henry's success, fell first. Having failed to secure the annulment Henry so desperately wanted, Wolsey was stripped of power, humiliated, and died on the road while being escorted to London, a fate Henry spoke of with chilling indifference. Sir Thomas More, a friend from Henry's youth, a scholar he admired, was sentenced to death for refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the Church of England. More's execution struck Europe like a thunderclap. A philosopher had knelt before the blade because a king demanded absolute spiritual obedience. Thomas Cromwell, the political genius who had engineered Henry's break with Rome, transformed England's bureaucracy, and enriched the crown through the dissolution of monasteries, eventually met the same end. His crime, arranging a marriage Henry disliked. For that misjudgment, the man who had reshaped the nation was destroyed by the very monarch he had empowered. England became a labyrinth, where every step might be fatal. Courtiers learned to bow deeper, speak softer, breathe carefully. In those years, people said that Henry's mood was the law, and the law could change between sunrise and sunset. In the midst of this inner collapse, Henry tried to preserve the illusion of his earlier life by marrying again. First, Anne of Cleves, a diplomatic match arranged through portraits and letters. When Henry met her in person, he recoiled, feeling deceived by artistry. The marriage was annulled within months. Then came Catherine Howard, barely more than a girl. Her youth temporarily revived Henry's vanity, but when rumours of her past and then her affairs reached him, rage consumed him. She was executed in the year 1542, crying for mercy that never came. His final wife, Catherine Parr, offered companionship and intelligence. She acted as a nurse, a reader, a steadying hand. But even she navigated the court with caution, knowing too well what happened to women who displeased him. Meanwhile, Henry's policies reshaped England with a force history could not ignore. He dissolved more than 800 monasteries, tearing down religious houses that had stood for centuries. He seized their lands, sold their treasures, and redistributed their wealth, enriching the crown but destroying the spiritual and communal lives of thousands. Monks, nuns, and lay brothers became wanderers. Villages lost the institutions that fed the poor, taught the children, and cared for the sick. Yet, while he dismantled the old religious world, Henry built something new. He expanded the Royal Navy, laying the foundations of England's future dominance at sea. He constructed coastal fortresses, introduced new military technologies, and positioned England as a rising power on the European stage. He was, in the same breath, a builder and a destroyer. A king with two faces, like the Roman god Janus, one looking toward creation, the other toward ruin. And through it all, the wound in his leg continued to rot, a constant reminder of his own mortal weakness. The stench followed him. The pain shaped him. Each pulse of infection reminded him of time slipping away. It was the physical symbol of a deeper truth. The monster England now feared had not come from his bloodline, but from fear, grief, and power left unchecked. A monster sculpted not by destiny, but by suffering. Henry had 3 children who survived into adulthood: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. Each of them carried a fragment of him, a glint of his ambition, a shadow of his temper, a whisper of his loneliness. Yet each one was also shaped and scarred by the storms that governed his life. They were his legacy, but they were also his casualties. Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, grew up watching her mother suffer humiliation after humiliation. She saw Catherine cast aside, forbidden from seeing her, stripped of her royal title, and finally left to die alone in the year 1536. That wound carved itself deeply into Mary's soul. She became a woman of iron conviction, a queen who believed suffering was the price of righteousness. When she finally ascended the throne, she tried with fierce determination and sometimes brutal methods to return England to the Catholic faith she believed her mother had died defending. Mary's reign was born from grief, shaped by exile, and steeled by abandonment. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, grew up under shadows even darker. She was marked from infancy by whispers of her mother's alleged incest, treason, and execution. Raised in uncertainty, she learned early that safety came from silence. She observed instead of spoke. She studied instead of complained. She wrapped her emotions inside layers of self-control so that no one could use her heart as a weapon. And when her time came, Elizabeth ruled for 45 years, guiding England into its golden age with brilliance, caution, and theatrical mastery. She had inherited none of her father's physical strength, but she carried the sharp edge of his will wrapped inside her mother's intelligence. Edward, Jane Seymour's son, was the fragile flame Henry had pursued for 3 decades. A boy cherished from birth, the symbol of legitimacy Henry had nearly destroyed his kingdom to obtain. But Edward's health was delicate, a body too frail for the weight of a crown. He became king in the year 1547, at only 9 years old, and he died at 15, leaving behind a kingdom unsteady and a succession in chaos. His short life was a reminder that even the victories Henry achieved came at a terrible cost. By the end of his own life, Henry had transformed into a figure so physically changed that those who had known the golden prince of his youth could barely recognize him. He weighed more than 140 kilograms. The wound in his leg, the same one that had torn open his destiny in the year 1536, had become a cavern of infection. Its stench choked those who served him. He could no longer walk without support. He had to be pulled onto his bed with a system of ropes and pulleys like a broken relic. And still, even in this final weakened state, his suspicion did not soften. He ordered more executions. He targeted even those of his own blood. Margaret Pole, nearly 70 years old, descendant of royal lines, was hacked to death in the year 1541, in an execution so clumsy and horrific that witnesses would never forget it. The kingdom carried the memory of that brutality like a bruise. As his body decayed, Henry sought salvation with a desperation that mirrored the terror of his youth. He created a complex will dividing the regency among 16 nobles, a council destined to break apart almost immediately. Everyone knew the truth. The king's death would reopen every wound, every rivalry, every struggle for power that he had spent his life trying to suppress. On the 28th of January, in the year 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. It was said that the night before he slipped into darkness, he whispered the name Jane Seymour, the only woman he had ever mourned, the only one he allowed into the quiet spaces of his heart. In death, he joined her, buried beside her in St. George's Chapel at Windsor beneath a simple black slab. Too simple for a man whose breath once made Europe tremble. Henry's legacy cannot be painted in one colour. He was cruel, yet visionary, destructive, yet foundational. He tore down more than he built, yet the pieces he left behind formed the England that would rise after him. His life stands as proof of an ancient truth. When power is absolute, a man will destroy himself long before he destroys the world around him. When Henry VIII breathed his last, the weight of the English crown descended not upon the shoulders of a seasoned warrior or a trained statesman, but upon the narrow frame of a 9-year-old child. Edward VI, the only legitimate son of Henry and Jane Seymour, was no fiery prince destined for battlefields, no radiant heir bred for spectacle. He was a quiet, intelligent, fragile boy, raised not among the noise of tournaments, but among tutors, scriptures, and the soft rustle of political whispers that filled palace corridors. He spoke Latin and Greek with the ease of a native tongue, reciting passages from the Church Fathers before most children learned to ride a pony. But his brilliance lived inside a body that betrayed him. Thin lungs, delicate bones, a slightness that made him seem more spirit than flesh. Those who watched him learned quickly that Edward was not a sun meant to rise high in the sky, but a pale star flickering through a long winter night. And so, the true power of England slipped immediately into the hands of the men who ruled for him the Council of Regency. At the head of that council rose Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the king's maternal uncle. Somerset dreamed in sweeping strokes, imagining a perfect Protestant kingdom, a realm purified of superstition and ritual. Under his rule, ancient altars were torn down, saints' images were smashed, and the old Latin Mass sung for over 1,000 years was abolished. Monasteries, still clinging to life under Henry, were swept away entirely. But Somerset's reforms moved too quickly, too absolutely. The people could not keep pace with the ground shifting beneath their feet. And so the year 1549 erupted. In Devon and Cornwall, villagers rose in the Prayer Book Rebellion, demanding the return of the old Latin liturgy. They marched under banners, stitched with wounded saints and pleading angels, begging for the world they understood. In Norfolk, furious tenants gathered under the banner of Kett's Rebellion, protesting the enclosures that stole common fields and turned farmland into private pastures. They built makeshift courts beneath oak trees, demanding justice from a government far away and deaf to their hunger. Both uprisings were crushed. Blood pooled in market squares, along hedgerows, in fields that only months earlier had grown barley. Somerset, blamed for the chaos, was stripped of power. He was replaced by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, a man more subtle in strategy, colder in calculation, and infinitely more ambitious. Dudley understood a truth Somerset had ignored. The young king was dying. Edward's coughing deepened. Blood stained his linen. His cheeks hollowed, his strength faded. By the year 1553, the boy was only 15 and already fading like a candle left in a draught. Dudley knew that if Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, a devout Catholic, became queen, everything he had built would crumble. His family would be ruined. His life would hang by a thread. So Dudley moved with ruthless precision. He persuaded the dying Edward to sign the device for the succession, excluding both Mary and Elizabeth from the throne. In their place, he placed Lady Jane Grey, granddaughter of Henry's younger sister and Dudley's own daughter-in-law. A girl of extraordinary education, fluent in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, but a girl nonetheless, and one who never sought the crown. While Edward wasted away, Dudley arranged alliances, secured supporters, and prepared England for a new queen. On the 6th of July in the year 1553, Edward VI died. His breath left his body quietly, without ceremony, without triumph, a small flame extinguished before it could warm the world. He had never truly been a king, not in power, not in presence, not in time. The reign of Edward VI was like a streak of blue fire, bright for an instant, trembling with promise, then gone. His short life left England colder than before, the nation standing once again at the edge of uncertainty, waiting for the next storm to break. Lady Jane Grey, granddaughter of Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, was a fragile figure wrapped in brilliance. Her mind blazed with languages. Latin, Greek and Hebrew slipped across her tongue when she was barely a teenager. But the Tudor world had no patience for such brightness, especially when it came from a woman. Intelligence in a man was admired. In a woman, it was dangerous. When Edward VI died, John Dudley pulled Jane into the machinery of ambition. She begged him not to. She wept, insisting she had no desire for the crown, no wish to challenge Mary or Elizabeth. But the Tudor machine did not run on desire. It ran on fear, power, and cold calculation. Jane was placed in the Tower of London, not as a prisoner but as a queen in waiting, dressed in royal silks that felt like chains, gripping a sceptre with hands that trembled so violently the jewels rattled. On the 10th of July, in the year 1553, she was proclaimed Queen Jane. Trumpets sounded across the city, proclamations were read aloud, and officials knelt before her. But outside the walls, England stirred, and not for her. The people rose behind Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, the woman they believed was the rightful heir. As crowds gathered around Mary's standard, Jane's kingdom existed only on the parchment where her name had been written. For 9 days, Jane lived inside the tower like a bird trapped in a golden cage. Every footstep echoed with dread. Every whisper behind a closed door sounded like the scrape of a blade. Dudley's armies deserted him, nobles fled, and the tide of loyalty rushed entirely toward Mary. The moment the realm recognized Mary's legitimacy, Jane's reign collapsed like a sandcastle in a rising tide. On the 19th of July, Mary entered London to the sound of jubilant bells. Crowds wept, sang, and threw flowers in her path. Jane, meanwhile, was escorted back to her rooms in the Tower, returning to the place she had never truly left. She had been a queen only on paper. In reality, she had always been a prisoner of politics. Mary did not wish to harm Jane. She saw her as a victim, a girl manipulated by Dudley's schemes. Mary planned to spare her, perhaps release her, perhaps allow her to fade quietly into the background where she could do no harm. But England was a country made of flint in those years, and a single spark could ignite it. The spark came in the year 1554, Wyatt's rebellion, an uprising outraged by Mary's proposed marriage to Philip II of Spain. Jane was nowhere near the revolt, but the rebels claimed they were fighting to prevent England from falling under foreign influence, and some spoke her name as a Protestant symbol. That was enough. To Mary's advisers, Jane was no longer an innocent girl. She was a banner, a rallying point, a threat, and so Mary bowed to the pressure she had hoped to resist. On the 12th of February that year, Jane, only 16, was led through the frost-covered courtyard of the Tower. Witnesses said she walked steadily, though her small frame shook beneath her cloak. On the scaffold, she spoke softly, asking for forgiveness, offering prayers, clinging to the last shred of dignity left to her. When the executioner told her to place her head on the block, she reached out but could not find it. Blindfolded, terrified, she whispered, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," her voice breaking as she searched the empty air. A guard guided her hand. She laid her head upon the cold wood. One stroke. One moment. A mind of extraordinary brilliance went dark. The Tudor dynasty swallowed her life as effortlessly as it had swallowed so many others, not only its enemies but its own. Jane's death was the first brutal reminder that this dynasty did not merely devour those who opposed it. It devoured its daughters, its nieces, its prodigies, anyone the crown found inconvenient. Her 9 days as queen became a legend. Her 16 years of life became a warning, and her final breath became the echo of a truth England would learn again and again, that under the Tudors, innocence offered no protection at all. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, carried a life already torn long before she ever touched a crown. She had been born into warmth, into a marriage that once looked like a beacon of alliance between England and Spain. But as she grew, she watched that world collapse piece by piece. She saw her mother cast aside, stripped of dignity, and sent into a lonely exile. She saw herself declared illegitimate, her title erased as if she had never belonged. And worst of all, she was forbidden from seeing Catherine, as the older woman lay dying in the year 1536. Mary never recovered from that final wound. It stayed with her like a bruise beneath the skin, invisible yet aching with every breath. So when she ascended the throne in the year 1553, nearly 40 years old and scarred by 2 decades of humiliation, Mary carried with her the determination of a woman who wanted not vengeance, but restoration. She believed England had been spiritually broken, severed from the faith of her ancestors, and from the God she felt had sustained her during years of suffering. To heal England, she believed she must return it to the Catholic faith, the faith her mother had died defending. But in Tudor England, even the purest intention opened the door to consequences steeped in fire. To restore England's place on the European stage, Mary entered a marriage she hoped would bring political strength and personal comfort. She wed Philip II of Spain. But the people of England despised the match. They whispered that Philip was a foreign tyrant, that he would steal their autonomy and swallow the nation into the Spanish Empire. Crowds muttered insults, pamphlets spread venom, and Philip himself was no solace. Cold, formal, raised to view marriage as diplomacy rather than devotion, he treated Mary as a political partner, not a wife. Mary, already wounded, already fragile, felt her heart fracture again, more quietly but no less painfully. Then came the pregnancies that were not pregnancies at all. Twice, Mary's belly swelled. Twice, the royal physicians announced the expected birth. The court prepared her birthing chamber. Ladies in waiting recorded dates. Midwives lit candles for safe delivery. But no child ever arrived. No cradle was filled. Only silence and humiliation, and a grief too deep for words. Desperate to save England from what she saw as spiritual ruin, Mary turned to harsh measures. She ordered the execution of roughly 270 Protestants. Among them, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, Bishop Hugh Latimer, and Bishop Nicholas Ridley. The fires at Smithfield illuminated the night sky with an orange, trembling glow, and those flames scorched Mary's memory for centuries. The world would later call her Bloody Mary, reducing her entire existence to the crackle of burning pyres. But the reality was far more complicated and far more human. Mary was not a monster. She was a woman shaped by suffering, convinced she was defending the faith that had held her together when everything else was taken. She lived in an age where rulers believed salvation could be enforced, where conscience was not a private matter but a question of national survival. Her tragedy was not cruelty, but loneliness. Not malice, but heartbreak. By the year 1558, Mary's health had deteriorated. She suffered from fever, abdominal pain, and a creeping despair that seemed to drain her strength day by day. She died that November alone, without a child to carry her name, without the affection she had sought all her life, without the peace she had tried so hard to find. And England, exhausted, frightened, ready to breathe again, opened its eyes to a new dawn under Elizabeth I. The contrast was so bright, so dramatic, that Mary's years came to be remembered only for their darkness. Yet she never truly deserved the name the world gave her. She deserved to be remembered as what she truly was, a woman who longed for love and certainty, a daughter who never healed, a queen who tried to mend a country in the only way she knew, and a soul who wandered all her life in search of kindness that never came. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, stepped onto the throne at 25 years old, with the poise of someone who had already survived a lifetime. She had no mother, no steady family, no circle of unconditional loyalty. She had grown up with caution braided into her bones, raised in a world where a whisper could kill and a rumour could destroy. But she also possessed the one skill that mattered most in the Tudor world, the intelligence to stay alive. Elizabeth understood a harsh truth from the moment she placed the crown on her head. If she appeared weak, the nobles would devour her in a week. If she appeared too strong, they would label her unnatural, a she-monster, trying to act like a king. So Elizabeth chose the narrowest, most dangerous path of all. She turned ambiguity into power. She revealed nothing she did not want to reveal. She loved no one publicly. She trusted almost no one privately. Her thoughts were a fortress, her expressions a mask, her silence a weapon. One of her first acts was to restore the Church of England, but not with the brutality of her father, nor the rigidity of her sister. Instead, she created the via media, the middle way, a settlement that balanced Catholic ceremony with Protestant doctrine. She rejected extremes because she had lived through them. Every law, every sermon, every prayer under Elizabeth reflected her belief that survival depended on moderation in a world hungry for absolutes. She ruled through language and subtlety. Diplomacy became her armor. Her letters confused ambassadors. Her speeches enchanted crowds. European courts feared her not because she commanded vast armies, but because she commanded uncertainty. With a raised eyebrow, she could stop an alliance. With a smile, she could change the course of a negotiation. No one ever knew which direction she would turn until she chose to turn. Under her reign, England blossomed. The years that had been soaked in blood under her father and sisters now ripened into a cultural spring. This was the age of Shakespeare, with his ghosts and kings and dreaming lovers. The age of Marlowe, whose verses burned like fire. The age of Drake and Raleigh, who carried England's flag across seas that once seemed endless. The moment that defined her rule came in the year 1588, the Spanish Armada. Spain, the greatest military power in the world, sent a massive fleet to crush England, restore Catholic rule, and dethrone her. Across the kingdom, fear trembled like a candle about to go out. Elizabeth rode to Tilbury to face her troops. She wore a silver breastplate that gleamed beneath the summer sun, and sat atop a white horse like a figure stepped out of myth. And there, in front of soldiers who feared the empire looming across the sea, she spoke the words that would carry her name across centuries. "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The Armada never reached her shores. Storm winds broke the formation. English ships harassed it with precision. What remained of the once invincible fleet drifted north in ruins, scattered like bones along the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. From that night on, Elizabeth was not merely a queen, she was a living legend. But legends come with a price. Elizabeth lived and died in a solitude few can imagine. She never married, never bore children, never shared her life with anyone in a way that softened her crown. Her only constant companion was England itself, a kingdom she treated as both burden and beloved. When she closed her eyes in the year 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended with her. Her body was laid in Westminster Abbey, beside the half-sister whose throne she inherited, as if the two daughters of Henry VIII, divided by faith and fate, were finally reconciled in death. From the ashes of Anne Boleyn's downfall, Elizabeth rose like a phoenix. She proved something no Tudor man had managed to show, that sometimes the greatest power is born not from a perfect lineage, but from wounds that refuse to break you. The Tudor dynasty lasted only 118 years, a brief flare compared to the long reigns of other royal houses, yet its imprint lies deeper than any dynasty that came before or after. It was not a quiet chapter in England's story, but a fault line, a place where the world cracked open and light and shadow spilled out together. It began with Henry VII, a man who emerged from mud and blood, holding a crown found in a thorn bush. He did not shine like the kings before him. He did not seek glory on battlefields. Instead, he built slowly, silently, crafting a financial state out of ruins, burying the remnants of the Middle Ages, stitching stability into a land hollowed by decades of civil war. His reign was quiet, but its consequences were thunder. The dynasty erupted under Henry VIII, who reshaped England with every breath. He shattered the old religious order, tore monasteries from their foundations, forged a navy that would one day rule the seas, and carved England into a nation unrecognizable from the one he inherited. Yet his legacy was a double-edged sword. For every new institution he created, he left a wound behind. His personal battles for heirs, for love, for legitimacy, bled into the lives of millions, leaving the kingdom spiritually and emotionally exhausted. The dynasty splintered under Edward VI and Mary I, two rulers born from the traumas of their parents. Edward, brilliant but frail, carried a crown heavier than his bones could bear. Mary, shaped by abandonment and humiliation, searched for healing in a return to the faith of her childhood, only to find that good intentions, in the Tudor world, often paved the road to suffering. Both were victims of the expectations placed upon them. Both were crushed beneath the weight of a world still trembling from their father's upheavals. And then came the final blaze. Elizabeth, stepping into history with the calm of a woman who had learned to survive storms before she learned to read. Her reign glowed so brightly with Shakespeare, with voyages across uncharted seas, with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the year 1588, that people almost forgot the bones beneath the golden floor. They forgot Anne Boleyn's execution. They forgot the terror of Mary's first years. They forgot Jane's 9-day reign and the blood spilled in the name of faith and legitimacy. Beauty has a way of softening memory, and Elizabeth's England was beautiful indeed. The Tudor story reminds us that history is not a chain of triumphs. It is a tapestry of wounds. Every king, every queen, every child in that dynasty carried the burden of a world changing too quickly. They lived at the edge of a new age, where old certainties died, and new truths had not yet been born. Some broke beneath that pressure. Some were transformed by it. The Tudors teach us that the hunger for legitimacy can drive a person to madness. The obsession with legacy can unravel an entire kingdom. And power, when unchecked, always demands a sacrifice, often from the innocent. Yet the Tudors also reveal the quiet, stubborn beauty of human resilience. Anne Boleyn walked to her death with grace that outlived her enemies. Jane Seymour soothed Henry's storm with gentleness rather than fear. Mary searched for love, even when the world refused to love her back. Elizabeth forged strength from solitude, turning her loneliness into a kingdom's golden age. The Tudor dynasty was both nightmare and symphony. A reign remembered not because it lasted long, but because it revealed in raw and unforgettable ways what power does to the human heart. And that is why the Tudors endure, not because of their victories, but because of the beautiful, terrible humanity of those who were broken beneath the crown. As we drift toward the end of this long journey through the Tudor world, let the noise settle, let the sharp edges soften, and allow the story to breathe out one last quiet sigh. You have walked beside kings and queens, seen crowns rise from mud and fall into dust, and watched how fragile even the mightiest hearts can be. But now, as the echoes fade, imagine the great halls emptying, the torches growing dim, and the heavy doors closing gently behind us. The storms of that dynasty, the voices of Henry, Mary, Elizabeth, they begin to dissolve into the distance, like mist thinning under the first hint of morning. Their battles, their fears, their triumphs, all of it slowly unravels into a soft, distant glow. What remains is not the violence, not the crowns, not the flames or the whispers, but the quiet reminder that every soul who lived beneath those jewels was simply human and breakable, and longing for peace in a world that rarely gave it. If you listen closely, beneath the weight of history, there is a gentler message tucked away in their stories. A reminder that legitimacy, legacy, power, these things can devour whole generations, but compassion, resilience, and dignity can outlive even the sharpest swords. A reminder that no matter how vast a kingdom may be, each person carries a private world of wounds and hopes and quiet courage. And perhaps most of all, a reminder that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the trembling hand that still reaches forward, the soft voice that still speaks, the lonely child who still chooses to stand. Let those thoughts settle in your mind like snowflakes, slow and weightless. Let the last images of the Tudors drift away, the battles fading, the palace corridors closing, the echoes falling silent one by one, until all that remains is calm and softness and a gentle, warm space just for you. You've spent a long time with this story tonight. You've travelled across a century of triumphs and heartbreaks. Now it's time to let your breath slow, to let your shoulders loosen, to let your thoughts float like lanterns on a still lake. The night is here to hold you. You are safe to rest. You are safe to let go. Thank you for being here, for sharing this quiet journey with me. If you'd like to join us again for more stories, more soft history, more slow nights, more gentle escapes, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss any of the new videos we create for you. And now, close your eyes, let the world dim, and sleep well, my friend. Good night.